Greetings, friends. This is Malik Jabbar, author of the Astrological Foundation of the Christ Myth and other books on the subject of astrotheology. I am adding some additional information to the previous video on the typology of Jesus Christ. Typology is a very important subject because its definition goes to the core of explaining exactly how the biblical Jesus came to be. Typology indicates that the Jesus Christ of the New Testament is a composite figure of various characters of the Old Testament, and that the creators of the New Testament of the Bible used the Old Testament as a guide in constructing the storyline of the New Testament. Take note of the quotation from my book, The Astrological Foundation of the Christ Myth, Book 4. This quotation goes to the core of our presentation, that the biblical Jesus was a product of literature and not of history. And those who composed the New Testament Gospels used the Old Testament as source material by which to construct the character of the mythical Jesus. So in this video, I am presenting some additional information in this regard. So let us continue. In part 1 of the Jesus typology, we brought forth indisputable evidence that the crucified Christ that allegedly died for the sins of the world was in fact a humanized copy of the sacrificial lamb that was ritually slaughtered by the Jews as a sacrifice for the sins of the Jewish people. We did this by proving that certain verses from the New Testament were actually revised copies of verses from the Old Testament relevant to a bloody lamb sacrifice at the Jewish Passover. At this point, I want to exhibit additional parallels between the Old Testament to the New Testament. These parallels present irrefutable evidence that the writers of the Gospels simply edited portions of the old Jewish scriptures and subsequently transcribed the edited Jewish text into the Gospels, with the false claim that certain common phrases from the Jewish Bible were statements that originated with Jesus Christ. But we know that Christ is actually a literary creation and not an historical figure. Right here before us, we have a sample of verses from the Bible, from the New Testament and from the Old Testament. I want to use this to exemplify how clear the evidence is that the information that we find in the New Testament, the verses that we find in the New Testament, were clearly, in many cases, copied from the Old Testament. This is just an abbreviated sample. I have 10 verses here, but there are hundreds of verses that could be pulled up. But I've just pulled up these few to prove this point. Now, on the left here, we have the New Testament verses, which are the Christian verses. And on the right here, we have the Old Testament verses, or the Jewish verses. And you know our premise concerning the typology is that the Jesus Christ of the New Testament is a literary figure, and that in the composition of the Gospels, the editors, they use the Old Testament as source material, and they simply transferred data, sayings, verses, information from the Old Testament into the New Testament in a spiritualized form, with the focus on Jesus Christ as the so-called Son of God. But right here, Matthew 5:5, it said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." This is something that Jesus said in the New Testament. But we look back in the Old Testament in Psalms 37:11. "But the meek shall inherit the earth, and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace." The similarity is too great to be coincidental. Right here in Matthew 22:44, the Lord said unto my Lord, "Sit thou on my right hand, till I make thine enemies thy footstool." But we go back to the Old Testament in Psalms 110:1, a psalm of David. "The Lord said unto my Lord, Sit thou at my right hand, until I make thine enemies thy footstool." Here we see the New Testament almost matches the Old Testament word for word, an obvious copy. Matthew 27:46, "And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," that is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Again, we go back to Psalms. And Psalms and Isaiah, Jeremiah are some of the chief books, whereas they got the information, the verses, I should say, that they use to represent Jesus in the New Testament. I mean, they use the whole Bible, but there's a lot of references in Psalms and Isaiah. But anyway, Psalms 22:1, a psalm of David. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me, and from the words of my ruin? So the similarity is undeniable. And this was something allegedly said by David. And David is mythological too, but anyway, something said by the so-called King David many years before Jesus came on the scene. Here's another example. Matthew 22:37. Jesus said unto them, Thou shalt love thy Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. We go into the Jewish portion of the Bible in Deuteronomy 6:5. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And again, in this little sampling that I'm presenting to you, just to prove this point about copying from the Old Testament into the New Testament, we have Matthew 15:8-9. This people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth, and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. but in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. We go into Isaiah 29 and 13. Wherefore the Lord said, for as much as this people draw near me with their mouth, and with their lips do honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men. The point that we're making is as clear as day that the material that the editors use to create and compose the fictional Gospels was taken from the Old Testament Jewish portion of the Bible. The links are undeniable, and the only explanation for this similarity is that one was copied from the other. And since the New Testament followed the Old Testament by hundreds or thousands of years according to their chronology, it's obvious that the New Testament is the recipient of the information from the Old Testament. So I think the evidence is indisputable. And like I said, this is only a sampling. There are hundreds and hundreds of verses that prove this point. This is just a sampling of Old Testament, New Testament parallels. The New Testament is loaded with verses copied directly from the Old Testament. This practice of copying is common in literature, but not in history. History does not repeat word for word. There's another factor that I want to discuss. It is important to understand that the founders of Christianity were Greek Jews, not just Jews, but a faction of Jews, Hellenized Jews, that rejected traditional Temple Judaism. There had long existed a religious schism, a division between the Temple Jews of Jerusalem and the Hellenistic Jews of the diaspora. The Maccabean revolt of the 2nd century BC was actually a civil conflict between the Hellenistic Jews and the Temple Jews of Jerusalem, wherein the Greek Jews, aided by Emperor Antiochus, attempted to eradicate Temple Judaism. The Greek Jews desired to overthrow the traditional Jews of Jerusalem because they rejected the primitive ritualism that predominated at Jerusalem. The Greek Jews rejected the daily animal sacrifices of the Temple Jews and other customs that put a wedge between the Jews and the greater Greek community. The attempt of the Hellenistic Jews to eradicate Temple Judaism during the Maccabean revolt was a failure. However, the Greek-speaking Jews of the diaspora never relented from their disdain for old-style Temple Judaism, with its incessant sacrifices and primitive rituals. In the century or so between the Maccabean revolt and the displacement of Greek sovereignty in the region by the Romans, the Hellenistic Jews remained unaffiliated with the Jerusalem Temple Jews. And certain Hellenistic Jews, based primarily at Alexandria, Egypt, later became the founders of the Jewish sect that over time evolved into Christianity. Of course, after the Gentiles became the dominant ethnic force within the new sect, then Rome became the controlling force instead of the Jews of Alexandria. But the original Christians were Jews that spoke the Greek language, and all of their Jewish scriptures were written in Greek. This is why all of the early Christian writings were likewise transmitted in the Greek language, not Hebrew, as one would have suspected to be the case if the religion was founded by a living Jesus. That is to say, a living Jesus that spoke Hebrew or Aramaic. But such was not the case, because the original Christians were Hellenized Jews who sought to establish a new spiritualized form of Judaism and rejected the old form of Judaism of the Jews headquartered at Jerusalem. Okay, that's about it. I've written 7 books on the subject of astrotheology. The Astrological Foundation of the Christ Myth in 4 volumes. The Biggest Lie Ever Told. Lifting the Gnostic Veil. And the Secret Origins of Judaism. You can go to my site, thechristmyth.com, and you can read excerpts from my books and also some of my unpublished writings. And I post these videos as often as I can, so if you push the subscribe button, you will be notified whenever the next video comes available. And so I thank you, and I appreciate your time.